Hello, everyone. Welcome. Does anybody have any thoughts why you think it is important for sponsors to meet the residency requirements? Yes. You posted a comment to provide settlement support. Any other thoughts about why it's important for sponsors to meet the residency requirements? It's important for citizens to be doing work for the benefit of their country, fulfill the obligations of the sponsorship. So who wants to give a shot at what residency requirements means? What are we talking about here? Thank you for that. Yes, that's correct. So why do you think IRCC expects the sponsors to meet the residency requirements and not the refugees? Thank you for that response. Yes, I think you hit it right on the nail. Sponsors are the ones who are obligated, right? They've signed a contract with the government of Canada. So the refugees, their application, it's not necessarily a contract. It's just an application, and IRCC says whether they can reside in Canada or not. When they become permanent residents, of course, they have responsibilities and obligations like the rest of us do. But that's apart from their application process. But when they arrive in Canada, what are one of the key rights that they have, as anybody does who lives in Canada? Yes, yes, they can. They can choose to live wherever they wish to in Canada as permanent residents. It is one of the fundamental basic human rights that all of us have in Canada. And so we cannot force, coerce, or require refugees to remain in the community of settlement or even to arrive here. Now, with that said, doesn't that make it difficult for sponsors? How do you navigate that? Thank you for that. I'm just going to jump into the chat. I see we've got a few messages here. Had mentioned accountability and responsibility for the well-being and settlement of refugees. Yes, that is what we are agreeing to when we sign this contract with the government of Canada. And because it's a legally binding contract, we have to fill those obligations regardless of what the refugee decides to do. And I see you mentioned residency requirements help prevent fraudulent sponsorships where the sponsor has no real stake in the outcome. Financial accountability as well. Yeah. And so you commented, we need to find another SAW willing to co-sign the sponsorship agreement and commit to supporting refugees if they later choose to relocate. Thank you for your response. The refugee didn't apply to come based on their own financial ability. They're being brought in because someone committed to supporting them. Yes. So for all of these reasons that have been mentioned, that's why the residency requirements are in place, to ensure the successful integration of the newcomers. Now, what do you think sponsors can do to kind of mitigate or handle that potential that may exist, where the refugees may decide when they land at the airport not even to continue on to their final destination where their sponsors are? Or when they arrive, maybe they decide they want to move somewhere else away from where the community of settlement is. How can you deal with that as sponsors? Not after the fact, but preemptively. What are some things you can do? Yes, I think that's really important to have the conversation with them ahead of time and talk about the reality of some of the choices they may have. So let's say In the conversation before the application is even submitted, they said, well, we know there's lots of jobs in Toronto, so we eventually plan to move to Toronto where the jobs are. Say you're a sponsorship group in Edmonton. You would want to have the conversation to say, did you know how much it costs for someone to live in Toronto? And potentially the ability to get housing in Toronto might be more difficult than it is in Edmonton. And if you were to relocate to Toronto, you don't have the support that you would have if you stayed here with us in the first year that you live here, at least, because we can help you do all the paperwork that you need. We can take you to places. We can introduce you to people here who you may be able to find a job through. So having those kind of transparent conversations up front at the beginning really helps lessen the chance of secondary migration or self-destination. Just being truthful right from the beginning that they understand what their rights are and that you know what their rights are as well. But I like what suggested is to make sure you have sufficient funds available. So most sponsors, when they talk about sufficient funds, they look at the minimum RAP rates in the community of settlement at the time of arrival, because that is the actual amount you need to provide. However, if a refugee moves out of your community of settlement to a different community of settlement that is a higher cost, who pays for that difference? Yeah. So if the cost of sponsoring a refugee in Ottawa is about, let's just say it's $18,000 minimum. If they move to Toronto and it costs $5,000 more according to your RAP rate requirements, you have to continue providing financial support to them at the higher rate, which is based on their new location. It's not based on what you would have provided in Ottawa. It's what the cost of living is in Toronto. So explaining those things to the refugee ahead of time will help tremendously with managing expectations, both on the sponsor's part and on the refugee's part. So everybody is clear in their understanding. And I talk about these things because that's what it means when we say the sponsors need to meet the residency requirements. So if the sponsors have to ensure residency requirements are being met, and residency requirements means that the sponsors have to be located in the community of settlement. What other things can you do? So knowing they've moved from Ottawa to Toronto and none of the sponsors live there, what do you have to do as a sponsor, aside from providing the financial amount at that higher cost of living rate? This is a tough one. I see you've got your wheels turning. Think along the terms of who's going to help them get their settlement activities done. Yes. Try to find a sponsor or supports in the community they move to. Yeah. And wraparound support. Yes. A circle of support. How do you find essentially new sponsors in that community of settlement? That's one of your requirements if they move to a new location. Well, how do you do that if you've never been to that location? You know, if you've lived in Alberta your whole life and somebody moves to Toronto, you've never been to Toronto. You don't know anybody in Toronto. How do you go about finding new sponsors or settlement support? I see some comments in here. Do some research and forge connections. Yes. Assistance from RSTP or the SAW Association and networking. Yes. So if you are a sponsorship agreement holder or a constituent group or co-sponsor working with a SAW, then you'll obviously notify the SAW to let them know about secondary migration. But then you would want to reach out to settlement agencies in that new location where they chose to move to. Connecting them with a settlement agency is one of the key things you can do for them, especially if you don't know anybody there. But yes, use your networks. If you're not part of a sponsorship agreement holder and you're a group of 5, see if there is anybody who has connections within your community and your own networks that might be willing to assist. And so there's 2 ways they can assist, right? They can become official sponsors and sign the undertaking document. So they take on the full legal responsibility, and then you are relieved from that responsibility. But as you heard, that's difficult to do, especially if you don't have a personal connection. Many people won't want to sign a contract like that. But you could instead ask someone to be your representative in the community of settlement. And that does not put them under any legal liability at all. The legal liability still remains with you as the person who signed the contract. So if you're going to name somebody as your representative in that community of settlement, you want to know it's somebody you can trust to fulfill the settlement responsibilities that you yourself would do if they remained in your community. And that way, it makes it easier to try and find someone who's willing to help. If they know they're not legally obligated for anything and they're just helping out of the goodness of their heart and you trust them, you believe that they're committed, then you can appoint someone in the community of settlement. Having said that, it doesn't mean you've wiped your hands clean and leave it up to them to do everything. You have to monitor and check in with them and with the refugee directly to make sure they're receiving the support that they require. And if the refugee says, no, I don't want any help from this person, then you're back at, the beginning stage where you always have to notify IRCC when secondary migration or self-destining happens. And when you do that, they're going to want to know, what have you done to make sure the residency requirements are being met? So document everything. Make sure you keep copies of email correspondence, that you have a logbook of activities that you have done to try and ensure things are happening. So write down the name of the settlement agencies you spoke to and the conversations. If you had phone conversations with the refugees, write down the date and time and the correspondence that you had. And that is just establishing that you've done your due diligence to ensure that the residency requirements could be met. If all else fails and you're not able to, or the refugees refuse to correspond with you, which does happen in some cases, especially if no prior relationship exists, then as long as you've done your due diligence, IRCC may declare a breakdown in the sponsorship. And what that does is it releases you from your obligation. So the contract is broken, and those refugees, if they're corresponding with IRCC, they may be taken on as government-supported refugees under the RAP program, possibly at that point. But you can't request the breakdown in sponsorship. IRCC is the one who has to declare it. So you have to do all your due diligence first, and then IRCC will notify you, okay, given the circumstances, we're going to declare a breakdown. Now, under normal circumstances, a breakdown in sponsorship is considered a bad thing. That's a mark against you as a sponsor. It means that you haven't fulfilled your obligations. But in this case, when it comes to secondary migration or self-destining, as long as you've done your due diligence as sponsors and gone through the steps that IRCC expects you to, then this would be considered a no-fault breakdown, which means no fault will be assigned to you as sponsors, and it won't impact any future sponsorships that you wish to engage in. However, if they find that there is fault of the sponsor that mobilized the refugees to leave, let's say the sponsors were not kind to them and they were not getting any help from them, which is what motivated the refugees to leave, then they may assign fault with the sponsors. So just be aware of your obligations and to do your best to build those relationships well ahead of time to establish trust. And then if trust is established, chances are you won't run into problems of this nature when they do arrive. Well, hopefully this has got you thinking about one of the more challenging aspects that potentially might exist for sponsors. And just tying back to what I was saying earlier about making sure you have sufficient funds. This is why we say sponsors should have a contingency fund. And contingency simply means a backup source of funds that can be used in the event of secondary migration or anything unexpected comes up. Let's say a serious medical condition occurs that they aren't covered under their health plan for. You want to be able to access your contingency fund to pay for those things. Okay, I'm going to move on to my review of Module 4. So who can be a private sponsor? Well, private sponsorship is a group effort. Unlike family class sponsorships, individuals cannot be expected or solely relied upon to carry out the many tasks involved with settlement. Each person who intends to be a part of a sponsorship group must meet the following eligibility criteria to be a sponsor. They must be 18 years old. They must have citizenship, permanent residence, or Indian status. And they must live in the same community of settlement where the refugees expected to arrive. According to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, numbers 156, some people cannot sponsor or help with sponsorship. And these are people who have committed a serious crime in the last 5 years. And serious crimes in Canada actually includes impaired driving and domestic abuse. And it would refer to people who did not pay court-ordered money. So if they owe money, for example, for child support or spousal support. And it applies to those who may be under investigation or have a removal order. So for those who have been told to leave Canada, if the government said they must leave. And for those who may lose citizenship or permanent residence, if the government is checking if they will lose that citizenship. And it does not allow persons who are in jail now. So if they're in prison, they cannot be a sponsor. The sponsorship undertaking form, that contract you're signing, it includes this promise from the sponsorship group, which means that they will make sure no one could harm the refugees, especially those who help with their settlement. Sponsors must carefully check all volunteers using the rules from that previous slide we just talked about, because they're responsible for making sure the refugees are safe, treated well, and have their basic needs met. Now, there are 3 types of sponsoring groups that can privately sponsor refugees. In Module 4, you learned about sponsorship agreement holders, fondly known as SAWs. And some partner with constituent groups and co-sponsors. And you also learned about groups of 5, which can actually be more than 5 persons listed on the undertaking who are sponsors. And community sponsors who may or may not work with co-sponsors. And just a quick reminder that currently groups of 5 and community sponsors cannot submit applications in 2025. Now, when it comes to making decisions in the sponsorship agreement holder group, it's important to understand that each sponsorship agreement holder organization works in its own way, depending on how it's organized. SAWs may operate locally, which means they only operate within a specific city, or they may operate regionally, so within a specific geographical area, for example, Atlantic Canada could be a geographical area, or they may work nationally. Now, nationally means that they have constituent groups located in various locations across Canada. So if you think about religious organizations, for example, Mennonite Central Committee is the overarching national body, and they have churches across Canada located in cities in all provinces. And so as an organization that has those constituent groups across Canada, they operate as a national SAW. Now, these terms are used within the sponsorship agreement holders community and not necessarily specifically by IRCC. However, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada does know if a SAW has the resources to sponsor in different places across Canada. And an organization will not be approved to sponsor in a location outside their area unless they show they can have enough money and enough people in that location, like a constituent group or co-sponsor, to handle the settlement tasks. Next, we will look at how decisions are made in different types of sponsorship agreement holder organizations. So the first type of structure is a SAW that does not work with constituent groups or co-sponsors. And what this means is that they look after all of the sponsorship tasks and funding themselves. So they do all the fundraising and managing the funds given to the refugees, and they have a team to help with settlement activities. So this is how a local SAW usually works, where decisions are made mainly between the sponsorship agreement holder organization and the sponsored refugees directly. The second type of SAW structure is a sponsorship agreement holder that may give some responsibilities to a constituent group. But the sponsorship agreement holder still has the ultimate responsibility because that organization has signed an agreement with the Government of Canada. So a constituent group is usually part of the sponsorship agreement holder's overall structure, just like the example I mentioned before. For example, a faith-based organization that has many churches connected to it. But similarly, a corporate organization with regional offices across Canada may also engage in refugee sponsorships and be accountable to the head office that holds the SAW agreement. Now, constituent groups may be given responsibilities such as providing funds and settlement support, or perhaps they will work in collaboration with the SAW to provide funds and settlement team members. The sponsorship agreement holder may have multiple constituent groups, and a constituent group could be responsible for more than one sponsorship. Constituent groups should not make decisions about settlement support on their own. Decision-making should involve both the sponsorship agreement holder and the sponsored refugees. But remember, even if the constituent group has signed the sponsorship undertaking form, the sponsorship agreement holder organization is ultimately held responsible. Now for SAW structure number 3, this type of SAW just works with individual co-sponsors who may be related to the refugees and will take care of the settlement activities. And in some cases, they will provide the sponsorship funds. They may also work with co-sponsor organizations, such as a cultural association, which may help with funding or volunteer support for the sponsorship. When working with co-sponsors, the SAW may choose to only handle the application submissions, but it is also legally responsible for overseeing the settlement activities and fund distribution carried out by the co-sponsors. Co-sponsors should not make decisions on their own about settlement support. So decisions involve both the sponsorship agreement holder and the refugees. And the SAW is ultimately responsible, even if the co-sponsor organization has signed the undertaking form, or the co-sponsor individuals have signed the undertaking form. And lastly, we have some sponsorship agreement holders who choose to delegate settlement responsibilities to both constituent groups and co-sponsors working together. In this first example, the constituent group works with a co-sponsoring organization that provides the funds. Both the CG and co-sponsor share the responsibility of providing people for settlement activities. In this second example, the constituent group has 2 sponsorships submitted. For one, The co-sponsor family members provide the funds, and both the CG and co-sponsor share settlement responsibilities. For the other, the CG provides the funds, and the SAW and CG work together to provide volunteers for the settlement. So even when responsibilities are shared, the SAW remains ultimately responsible for the sponsorship. And the SAW should be involved in all decision-making and oversee the settlement activities. They should also stay in contact with the refugees directly to ensure they get the support they need and are part of the decision-making process. And that is because the SAW is ultimately held responsible. Now, when it comes to decision-making within the community sponsorship group, so this is typically an organization or association that is engaged in private sponsorships. So community sponsorship groups may be structured similar to sponsorship agreement holders that only work with co-sponsors. However, even if they delegate settlement tasks or financial support to a co-sponsor, the community sponsor organization is still ultimately liable for the sponsorships it undertakes. So they should always be involved in decision-making, even if they're not handling daily settlement tasks or providing funds. There should be regular reporting, creating a system where co-sponsors update the community sponsor on progress and issues they may encounter. The community sponsor should also meet refugees before they arrive and plan regular check-ins with the refugees without the co-sponsors to get honest feedback about their well-being. So this process is similar to what SAWs are expected to do in their sponsorships. And decision-making within the group of 5. So 5 or more people can come together to privately sponsor a refugee as a group of 5. And all members of the group are considered by IRCC to be jointly and severally or solidarily liable, which means that they are responsible both as a group and individually for fulfilling an obligation, even if they didn't agree to give funds for the sponsorship. For example, if one member of the group of 5 cannot provide their share of financial support, IRCC can ask any other member to pay the full amount. That member can then try to recover the missing funds from the person who didn't pay. So the group is responsible both collectively as a unit and individually for the entire sponsorship obligation. This is why it's important for all group members to be a part of the decision-making for a group of 5 sponsorship. And the group must also agree on how to carry out the settlement plan and choose one person to be the primary sponsor who will create and submit the application in the permanent resident portal. A group of 5 can choose to sponsor multiple refugees. However, they must make sure they have enough funds for each sponsorship, especially if both sponsorship cases were to arrive at the same time. And a G5 group doesn't have co-sponsors, but they can add as many people as they want to sign the undertaking form, so they are not limited to just 5 members. Now let's take a look at that pre-submission process. So before starting the application, sponsors should first gather a committed team of eligible people. They should then connect with RSTP to understand the type of sponsorship and the program they'll use, and how to create a plan detailing the who, what, where, when, and how of the settlement process. Stage 1 involves 3 steps for initiating the sponsorship. Step 1 is to form the group. When forming a group, consider reaching out to your local community. Host an information session and invite community groups, friends and neighbors, local media, and leaders like the mayor or MP. The more people involved in supporting newcomers, the better their integration will be. Use tools like Facebook group or email newsletter to keep people updated and maintain interest during the long wait. Be transparent about the process, including the time it may take, and make sure to find people who can commit to helping at every stage. Co-sponsors are usually individuals in Canada who are family members of the refugees. And as was mentioned already, individuals or organizations can be co-sponsors to either a community sponsorship group, a constituent group, or a SAW organization sponsorship. Now, step 2 is to select a program. The program you choose depends on whether you already have a specific refugee in mind. All sponsors can participate in blended visa office referred sponsorships or sponsor an LGBTQ plus individual through the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership with the Rainbow Refugee Society. However, only sponsorship agreement holders can sponsor refugees under the JAS, the Joint Assistance Sponsorship Program. Step 3 is to create a settlement plan. And the settlement plan is important for getting approval from IRCC, so make sure it's detailed and well planned. Fundraising is also a big task and should start early to show IRCC that you already have the money and that it hasn't come from the refugees. In Module 5, you'll learn how to create a settlement plan, calculate sponsorship costs, and apply any deductions. Stage 2 involves gathering information and completing the forms. When gathering supporting documents, refugees must provide documents demonstrating their need for resettlement to Canada. And sponsors must show proof of their financial ability. Many sponsors try to reduce costs by donating housing, furniture, clothing, etc. To have these donations recognized by IRCC, however, sponsors must keep receipts and official records showing the contact details for the donors. Supporting documents should be kept for the entire sponsorship and up to 2 years afterwards. Finally, with all of the previous steps underway or complete, you can begin working on the sponsorship forms. And you'll learn more about which forms are needed and how to submit an application in Module 6. But for now, we'll just review some general information about the forms. So there are 2 sets of forms, a set for the sponsors and a set for the refugees. There are also 2 stages of approval. The Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, fondly known as ROCCO, approves the sponsor's portion of the application, and the Visa Office Abroad determines the approval for the refugee portion of the application. Every application package should be checked before it's submitted to ROCCO to ensure it's complete and filled out correctly. Simple things can be checked, like has everyone signed and dated their forms properly? Are there any missing forms or documents? Has each sponsor provided their own email address? And have you included translations and all supporting documents? When it comes to blended visa office referred and joint assistance sponsorships, the refugees will already have been approved for resettlement, so only the sponsors' forms will be completed and then assessed by ROCCO once the sponsors are successfully matched with a refugee profile for those 2 programs. Now, the post-submission process begins with stage 3. In Canada, processing begins when private sponsors submit a complete application package to the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa. And when the application is received from the Permanent Residence Portal, an automatic email is sent to all group members notifying that the application was submitted. And ROCCO will first check to see if the sponsor's forms are complete. If anything is missing, the forms will be returned, and ROCCO will submit a template email to the sponsors with all possible reasons for return. If everything is in order, however, the sponsors will receive an acknowledgement of receipt, and a case number called a G number will be included. IRCC will then assess the sponsor's eligibility, including the settlement plan, financial documents, police checks, and their ability to fulfill their responsibilities. If approved, the sponsors will be notified, and the refugees portion will be sent to the relevant visa office abroad. Then stage 4 will begin. Once the visa officer overseas receives the application, then they will review the refugee's eligibility and admissibility for resettlement to Canada. So they will either call the refugee for an interview or send a request by email, although in some cases interviews may not be required. Sponsors should also expect to receive an email notice about the interview schedule and any additional documents requested by the visa office. This is to help you contact the refugee and ensure they don't miss any correspondence from the visa office. In some places, biometrics data is collected for security screening and to confirm dependent relationships. An IRCC will typically notify the refugee when they have been approved, and sponsors should get notified by email as well. However, they usually find out from the refugee first. Stage 5 begins when the refugee's permanent residence application is approved and travel arrangements are made, which we'll discuss in the next slide. So stage 5 begins when the refugee's permanent residence application is approved. Keep in mind that private sponsorship is a three-way partnership between the sponsors and the refugees, the sponsors and IRCC, and the refugees and IRCC. In the private sponsorship of refugees program, the International Office for Migration, known as IOM, is responsible for assisting PSR refugees located in many countries who are on their journey to Canada. And in some cases, they may even assist with obtaining their medical appointments and/or their exit visas. Once the application is approved and the visa office overseas finalizes a case, IOM will arrange for the Canadian Orientation Abroad session to help refugees prepare for their journey and arrival in Canada. And IOM will also typically assist with scheduling flights and obtaining one-way travel documents for those who do not hold a valid passport. Refugees are advised to use IOM support, especially with flight changes, cancellations, and potential border restrictions. The refugees will receive assistance from IOM throughout their travel to Canada if they have layovers and need food and accommodations, or when flights are changed or canceled. The visa office will arrange for travel loans if refugees can't afford the flights. Once in Canada, they must contact Collections Canada to defer repayment of that travel loan until the end of their settlement year. Now, once travel has been confirmed, IRCC will issue the notice of arrival transmission approximately 10 days before arrival. Before I come to questions, I'm just going to quickly review your important dates for you once more. So the 11th of May has passed. So all of you should have completed modules 1 through 4 and submitted your quizzes. Now, I noted some of you had missed that deadline. You have been given an extension until Tuesday, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time to submit your quiz for Module 4. Now, that extension was only provided to those who had completed up to Module 3 and just missed submitting the quiz for Module 4. Anybody who has not even started, you unfortunately will need to re-enroll in the course and start from the beginning. We've noticed that you've probably been too busy to keep up with the rest of the students, so you will be automatically removed from the course at this point. This Wednesday at 4:30 p.m., May 14th, we are going to review quizzes 1 through 4, and then the 8th of June is when modules 5 through 8 will need to be completed and the quizzes submitted. The 11th of June is when we'll review quizzes 5 through 8. The 15th of June is when the final exam is due, and the 18th of June is when we'll review the final exam. And as always, here's the contact information if you need any help. Any questions about the review on Wednesday? Just to let you know, I don't record the reviews, so they won't be recorded and posted. So unfortunately, if you missed attending the review, you won't be able to come back to it later.